I'm Caitlin Collins, and this didn't just happen to Nicolas Maduro. In less than 48 hours, a sitting president was taken by US forces from a compound in Caracas and placed inside a New York courtroom. Not as a guest, not as a negotiator, but as a criminal defendant. That single moment shattered an assumption the world has lived with for generations, that heads of state are untouchable. Maduro pleaded not guilty to conspiracy charges, accusing him, his family, and senior officials of turning Venezuela into a highway for cocaine, working with groups the United States now designates as terrorist organizations. His lawyers call it illegal. He calls himself a kidnapped president. Legal experts say much of the evidence remains classified, built quietly over more than a decade. And yet, the trial moves forward. If this feels bigger than Venezuela, that's because it is. If you want clear analysis without propaganda or panic, stay with me. Because before we debate legality or innocence, we need to understand what the United States is actually accusing and why this case redraws the rules. I'm going to slow this down for just a moment because clarity matters here. At the center of this case is not one allegation, but a system. US prosecutors say Nicolas Maduro didn't simply preside over a corrupt state. They allege he helped build a criminal enterprise from inside the government itself. The charges focus on a long-running conspiracy, trafficking large quantities of cocaine into the United States while partnering with groups the US has formally designated as terrorist organizations. Prosecutors argue this wasn't incidental or indirect. They claim it was organized, protected, and sustained by people at the highest levels of power. Maduro, his wife, his son, senior ministers, and alleged gang leaders are all charged together, accused of abusing public office, corrupting institutions, and using state power to provide cover for drug shipments moving through Venezuela toward the US. Maduro rejects all of it. He says this is imperial overreach, a political attack disguised as justice. His lawyers argue he should be immune as a sovereign leader. That tension between criminal law and global power is where this case truly lives. And to understand how we got here, we have to go back to the beginning. To understand this indictment, you have to rewind the clock far before the courtroom, far before the raid. US prosecutors say this story begins in 1999, when Nicolas Maduro first entered public office. At that point, Venezuela was not yet a narco state in the global imagination. Its institutions still carried legitimacy. Its borders still functioned as borders. But over time, prosecutors allege power concentrated, institutions weakened, and the line between the state and organized crime began to blur. According to the indictment, Maduro and his inner circle didn't exploit chaos, they engineered stability for criminal activity. They allegedly used government authority to provide passports, diplomatic cover, and protection to traffickers. Law enforcement wasn't dismantled, it was repurposed. When Maduro became president in 2013, prosecutors say the system didn't change, it scaled. The drug trade allegedly flourished not in spite of the government, but because of it. Not as a side effect, but as a revenue stream. This wasn't random corruption. It was a structure, a cycle. And once built, it demanded loyalty or silence. And that system would soon face its first real rupture. The first rupture didn't come quietly. It came with names, documents, and an accusation that reframed everything. US prosecutors allege that Maduro's network wasn't acting alone. They say it partnered with armed groups and cartels that operated across borders groups the United States now classifies as terrorist organizations. The FARC, the Sinaloa cartel, Los Zetas, Tren de Aragua. That allegation matters because it transforms the case from drug trafficking into something far more explosive: narco-terrorism. According to the indictment, these weren't loose relationships. Prosecutors claim Maduro's circle provided law enforcement cover and logistical support for cocaine shipments, fully aware they were bound for the United States. Venezuela, they allege, became a protected corridor. This is also where violence enters the case. Prosecutors accuse the defendants of ordering kidnappings, beatings, and murders to enforce discipline and collect debts. State power, they argue, wasn't just corrupted, it was weaponized. Maduro denies every word of it. His wife pleads not guilty. Their lawyers say the evidence hasn't been shown. And that's the point. If you're trying to understand this case, don't just ask what they're accused of. Ask why these accusations were chosen and why now. Because beneath the charges sits a deeper mechanism, still mostly hidden. What sits beneath this case isn't just an accusation of crime. It's an accusation about how power works when no one is watching. US prosecutors are careful here. They don't describe chaos, they describe control. A system where drug shipments moved not despite the state, but through it, escorted, protected, anticipated. According to the indictment, law enforcement wasn't absent. It was present in the wrong way. Police forces, intelligence channels, even diplomatic tools were allegedly used to guarantee safe passage for cocaine shipments headed north. The mechanism wasn't secrecy, it was normalization. Before Maduro became president, prosecutors say he facilitated passports and diplomatic cover. After 2013, they allege the structure expanded. The drug trade wasn't hidden in shadows. It operated under institutional protection, benefiting members of the ruling regime and Maduro's family. This is why the evidence matters so much and why so much of it is classified. These cases aren't built on one witness or one seizure. They're built over years, tracing patterns, relationships, and state behavior. And it explains why the defense keeps returning to one argument: immunity. Because if this mechanism is proven, it doesn't just condemn individuals. It challenges the idea that sovereignty itself can shield a system like this. And that's when the pressure begins to escalate. The pressure escalates when the case stops being abstract and becomes personal. Prosecutors don't just describe a system. They name the people who allegedly enforced it. The interior ministers who controlled the police, the gang leaders who moved cocaine, the allies who kept shipments flowing across borders. They accused Diosdado Cabello Rondon of working directly with Colombian traffickers to move massive quantities of cocaine toward Mexico and the United States. They accused Ramon Rodriguez Chacin of maintaining an estate that allegedly housed a FARC encampment and training site, shielded from prosecution in exchange for loyalty and money. And then there's Maduro's son. Prosecutors allege Nicolas Ernesto Maduro Guerra traveled repeatedly to Margarita Island on planes carrying packages military officials believed contained drugs. They say he discussed shipping low-quality cocaine to New York because it wouldn't sell in Miami. They describe plans involving scrap metal containers and cargo ships. This is the second rupture. Because once family members and senior ministers are named, the case stops being theoretical. It becomes a map of roots, of conversations, of intent. Maduro's son calls the US operation a threat to global stability. His father calls himself a prisoner of war. But from here forward, the story isn't just about power at the top. It's about what all of this means for the people living underneath it. This is where the story stops being about indictments and starts being about you. Because when prosecutors say the drug trade flourished, they're not talking about abstract numbers. They're talking about what happens when a system is built to serve power instead of people. If you're a Venezuelan citizen, this isn't just a legal case in New York. It's an explanation, maybe the first official one, of why institutions failed you, why gangs felt untouchable, why fear became routine, why leaving the country felt like the only option. US prosecutors allege state-sponsored gangs enforced this system, that violence wasn't random, it was ordered, targeted, used to protect profits and silence threats. And even if you don't live in Venezuela, this matters. Because cocaine shipped through protected corridors doesn't disappear. It fuels addiction, crime, and instability far beyond one border. If you've ever wondered how corruption becomes normalized, this is what it looks like. If you want analysis that centers people, not just power, stay here, share this. Because understanding systems like this is the first step to dismantling them. But this story doesn't end at Venezuela's borders. Its consequences ripple outward into global politics, global law, and global precedent. What happens next is where this case leaves domestic politics and enters the global arena. Because the moment the United States designated the FARC, the Sinaloa cartel, Los Zetas, and Tren de Aragua as terrorist organizations, this indictment stopped being just a drug case. It became a geopolitical signal. Prosecutors are effectively arguing that a sitting government partnered with groups now treated the same way the US treats global terror networks. That framing matters. It expands jurisdiction, it hardens alliances, and it forces other countries to choose how they respond. Some legal experts say the operation to bring Maduro to New York violated international law, including the UN Charter. Others say once he's on US soil, domestic law takes over. That contradiction is the fault line. Because if the seizure of a head of state becomes normalized, no leader can ignore it. Allies reassess protections, rivals reassess risk. And every government quietly asks the same question: what would protect us if this precedent spreads? This case also reshapes Latin America's balance. It pressures neighboring states. It complicates diplomacy. And it sends a message that sovereignty may no longer be absolute, especially when terrorism and transnational crime are alleged. And now, the world is watching not just for a verdict, but for what comes next. Now comes the hardest question. Not what happened, but what happens next. Based on what's already unfolded, this case points toward 3 possible futures. The first is the best case scenario, at least on paper. The trial proceeds under US law. Evidence is tested. Some remains classified. Some becomes public. The case sets a narrow precedent that extraordinary actions apply only to extraordinary allegations involving terrorism and transnational crime. The global system absorbs the shock. The second future is murkier. The trial moves forward, but the seizure overshadows the verdict. Other countries challenge the legality. Trust in international norms erodes. Power, not law, becomes the lesson observers take away. The system holds, but with visible cracks. The third scenario is the most dangerous. This becomes a model. Powerful states decide enforcement matters more than consent. Sovereignty weakens, retaliation follows. Stability gives way to suspicion. None of these futures depend on guilt or innocence alone. They depend on how the world interprets this moment. Because this case isn't just judging Maduro. It's testing whether the global order is still rule-based or already something else. And that brings us to the final question. I want to end where this story really begins. Not with Nicolas Maduro, not with a courtroom in New York, but with a line that has quietly shifted. For decades, the world operated on an assumption that sovereignty was a shield, that heads of state, however flawed, existed beyond the reach of foreign courts. This case challenges that assumption directly. The United States says this is about drugs, terrorism, and accountability. Maduro says it's about power, force, and precedent. Legal experts say both things can be true at the same time. And that's the uncomfortable insight. Because once a system proves it can reach across borders and take a leader by force, the question is no longer whether it will happen again. It's who decides, and under what rules. This trial will move slowly. Evidence will surface in fragments. Some doors will stay closed, but the impact is already here. If you want to understand how power is evolving, who holds it, how it's enforced, and what it means for the future, stay with this conversation. Share it, question it, because this wasn't just the arrest of a president, it was the creation of a precedent. And the world hasn't decided yet what to do with it.